It is time for a new dance to begin. The dance of death. This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you. I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa.
And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is episode 14 of season 5. And after The House on Haunted Hill, we decided we couldn't stop with just one Vincent Price classic. So join us as we discuss The Masque of the Red Death.
Okay, well, as most of y'all know, this movie, The Masque of the Red Death, was based on the short story by Edgar Allan Poe, which was published in 1842. This story is about a Prince Prospero who is trying to avoid a plague by hiding away in his abbey. And eventually he gets bored and invites all of his rich friends to quarantine with him, and they throw a lavish party. This is what happens in the short story, that is. I did want to point out, for those of you who have not read the Poe story, I mean, I'm assuming most people have because it's kind of a classic one. But if you haven't, there's a line that struck me in this read-through towards the beginning, and this is what it says. It was toward the close of the 5th or 6th month of his seclusion that the Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. And I don't think that struck me before, but now we're recording this. It's March in 2021, and all of us have effectively been dealing with pandemic quarantine now for a full-on year. And the fact that it only took him 5 or 6 months to basically just say, I'm done with this illness and I'm going to start seeing my friends, that I thought, I don't know, that it just struck me this time around. So yeah, Poe wrote that in 1842, and I feel like he was foreseeing a little bit of what 2020 and 2021 was going to be like, where everybody just gets a little tired of being cooped up inside their house because a sickness is ravishing their country. So they decide to throw a party. I will also point out that it is not the time to do it now. And it was not the time to do it then, because this story does not end well. What I remembered before the years 2020 and 2021, and when I first read this, the thing that stood out about this story were that there were 7 rooms, each with a different color. And that was part of this like lavish party, was that every room had a different theme going on. So his 1,000 friends could go through the blue room, the purple room, the green room, the orange room, the white room, the violet room. And then finally, and this was the room that was kept very secret to the end, it was a black and scarlet room that had a giant black clock in it ticking away. The story itself is very heavily influenced by Gothic novels. So the Poe story takes place in what is described as an abbey. Prospero obviously being a very like Italian, Spanish sounding name, kind of vaguely both, which a lot of Gothic novels had that as well. And Prospero, of course, he also took from Shakespeare's The Tempest. So the illness that takes place is the Red Death. It is described very grotesquely in this story as having devastated the country, that they had never seen an illness that had been so fatal. And it was called the Red Death because, this is a quote from the story, blood was its avatar, and its seal, the madness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding at the pores with dissolution. The scarlet stains upon the body, and especially upon the face of the victim, were the pest ban, which shut him out from the aid and from sympathy of his fellow men. And the whole seizure, progress, and termination of the disease were incidents of half an hour. So it's this idea that it was something that struck very quickly, and people died in a very horrific way. Just that was what always struck me when I read this story, was that it would cause you to profusely bleed from your pores. So that's why they called it the Red Death. So, of course, this film is based on that. Now, this film came out in 1964 and it was directed and produced by Roger Corman. So I feel like anytime we have Roger Corman's name on something, we need like a little asterisk if he's adapting something, especially like a Poe story, because he adds in a whole lot of stuff that wasn't in the Poe story. In fact, the party that is described in the Poe story, which is a relatively short story, only starts about halfway through the movie. So there's a whole bunch of other stuff that is leading up to it. But the screenplay, so of course, it's based upon the story by Edgar Allan Poe. But the screenplay was written by Charles Beaumont and R. Wright Campbell. Now, we've mentioned Charles Beaumont before on the podcast. He also did another Poe adaptation, The Premature Burial. He was, of course, a very famous short story horror writer, but he also worked on some anthology series like The Twilight Zone. Vincent Price, of course, plays Prince Prospero. He is the villain and the main character of the story. And I think Vincent Price this is Vincent Price at his best, I think. He is just at his most Vincent Pricey, if that makes sense. It also has two female leads. So there's Jane Asher as Francesca. And then there's also Hazel Court as Juliana, who is, if this were to be a Gothic novel, she would be our heroine that we follow. In other words, she is virtuous and beautiful and young and in love with somebody else. So therefore, the evil prince must have her. Hazel Court herself is a horror staple. She was also in The Premature Burial, which we already mentioned, written by Charles Beaumont. She became a name, I guess, in the horror genre with the movie The Curse of Frankenstein, but she's also been in a lot of other kind of horror sci-fi things, including several episodes of The Twilight Zone and other anthology series. And then this is just a little fun, I think, kind of trivia that I found on IMDb, so I'm going to throw it in here. Apparently, Jane Asher, who played Francesca, Prospero's, I guess she was supposed to be his wife, his consort. I don't know. Apparently, so she asked Roger Corman if one day, she said, they filmed this. This was one of Corman's, I think this was his first film that he actually filmed in England. And so they were there right outside of London filming this. And she said, would you mind? I have a friend in town. He's a musician and he's in town recording an album, like over in London. And he would like to see the movie set. Would it be okay if he comes and like watches for a day? And he was like, Corman was like, well, sure, bring him along. Anyway, it turns out that her musician friend was Paul McCartney. And this, of course, was 1964. So this was like just prior to like Beatlemania hitting the world. But Roger Corman had no idea who he was and apparently, really didn't talk to him about the whole day. But I just found that kind of fascinating, thinking there was this really, really wackadoo Poe adaptation being filmed. Because some of these scenes, we'll talk about them. But, and you have, Vincent Price running around on set. You have Roger Corman running around, and then apparently you also had Paul McCartney backstage. I just thought that was fascinating. But that's enough about the IMDb trivia. I am really curious to talk to Matt and Mel because I did not realize that neither of them had actually seen this. Y'all, this was your first time, right?
Yeah, this was my first time watching The Masque of the Red Death. I don't know why it took me so long, but it did. So I was happy we were using this particular movie because I've been wanting to watch it for a while.
Matt, was it the first time for you?
Yes, it was my first time watching it as well. And it was something. It's a very interesting movie, and I definitely have some thoughts that I'm sure we'll get into. I'm on the fence as to kind of how I felt about it. There were parts I liked and parts that I just kind of WTF'd my way through. So, but I can save that for the deeper discussion that's coming. But yeah, that initial thoughts are still kind of, well, Vincent Price is always fun because he was definitely just chewing the scenery for the whole movie. Like he was clearly having fun with this role. So that alone is always, like you said, I agree. He's just always fun to watch.
Oh man, he is, and just to say, I cannot remember when I saw this film for the first time. I think I was in high school. I know I went through a stage where I was really into Poe, so it might have been earlier than that. I read the story. I first read the story when I was in middle school, and I just remembered this one being one of my favorites because it's so like gross. It's just the idea. I also went through, now that I think about it, in high school, I went through a phase of only wanting to read horror stories if they dealt with like plagues or illnesses. So I read like the Andromeda Strain, and I think I read The Plague, and oh gosh, I read a bunch of them. But this was one that I reread a lot. And then finally I found the film and I was just like, this is the greatest thing ever.
Well, and speaking of gross, I'll go ahead and kind of lead in with one of my first thoughts I had about this, which was I was not expecting the Poe crossover of Hop Frog, because that's another very gross Poe story that involves, well, revenge and murder and gruesome deaths and whatnot. But I was not expecting that. I was a little confused, though, why they named the character Hop Toad instead of Hop Frog. I can't imagine that it's for any sort of copyright purposes. I'd imagine that Poe would have been in the public domain by that point, since they're already doing one Poe story. But I don't know. I don't know what their reasoning was for changing the name. But that was something that kind of took me by surprise, that there was sort of this subplot that was an entire other Poe story, which was one of the very first Poe stories I'd ever read. I think the first one I read was The Black Cat. No, I'm sorry, Cask of Amontillado, then The Black Cat, and then Hop Frog, I think in that order. So, yeah, that one's always had a very special place for me, probably for the same reason, because it's so gruesome and macabre.
Wow, I'm surprised you read Hop Frog that early. I don't know that I read Hop Frog until like college or even grad school, and I'd read a lot of Poe before that. It's interesting that you would have gotten to that one so soon. I wasn't expecting that subplot either. And the Esmeralda character creeped me out a little bit, because the people, the guy, basically be very lascivious toward her, and she's being played by a child who spoke with the voice of an adult woman. So I was totally kind of confused and creeped out by that whole exchange.
The adult woman's voice still gets me, like, every time.
Same. And were they trying to imply that she was also a little person like Hop Toad, and they just couldn't find someone? I don't know what they were doing with that, but I mean, it was clearly like a 9 or 10-year-old girl who was mouthing the words, and then it was overdubbed with this like woman's voice. It was really weird.
Yeah, it was really strange. And yeah, I wasn't sure why it needed to be a plot to this movie. I could kind of understand, because you have, I don't know. Now that I think about it, I'm not sure, because it seems like Alfredo was just the other aristocrat guy was there just for the Hop Frog subplot. It's not even that Prospero was the king that insulted Hop Toad. So I guess it's just supposed to be like more violence and disorder and monstrousness that's happening. I was surprised by that, and I was also surprised by the addition of Satanism to the story of the Masque of the Red Death. Though, I sat down and reread the Masque of the Red Death yesterday, because it's only 5 pages long, and it talks about Prospero is like pretty wanton and evil and blasphemous. So it doesn't take much for someone to read that part and extrapolate it into what happened. But yeah, Vincent Price is like a mad sorcerer with his mistress. I don't even think Juliana was his mistress. Like, she was basically just competing with him and trying to become just as powerful as him. It was weird, because the two women were not competing for a man at all in this movie, which was really interesting to me. Juliana wants power. Francesca's a poor little peasant girl that Vincent Price's character wants to corrupt, because he loves to corrupt things. He loves to corrupt people who have faith. So it was really interesting that Francesca is like faithful in her Christian faith, I guess, and Juliana's faithful to wanting to have this relationship with the devil. That's what she's so excited about at the end. She wants to use Prospero, it seems like to me, to get to that point. So the juxtaposition of those two women were really interesting, and the juxtaposition of Juliana against Vincent Price's character was interesting too.
Well, speaking of that, and I know we're kind of going out of order as we're talking about this movie, but the thing about Juliana I thought was really fascinating too was that, initially, like, he did want to corrupt her, and there were all sorts of, I mean, that's what he does. He likes to see people like acting greedy and acting, lascivious, and he loves kind of being the puppet master with all that thing. But I think that the thing that struck him was that she was uncorruptible, and that was what held his interest for so long. Because I have a feeling if she had been a different person, she wouldn't have been in the movie as long as she was, because he made that interesting comment towards the end where he said that she was the only person whose faith was as strong as his own, which I thought was really fascinating, because obviously, like, they believed in different deities and they had faith in different things, but like, he pinpointed her as being almost like the same as him in a weird sort of way. And that was what allowed him to respect her. Like, I mean, if you can, I'm using air quotes when I say that, but yeah, she was a really, really interesting character. And she wasn't, I guess we should say, was not at all in the Poe story. Like, this was completely an invention of the movie, and a really interesting one.
Oh yeah, I thought the Francesca character was fascinating, because I do think that he is fascinated by her because, just like you said, her faith is like just as perfect as he thinks his faith is. Of course, he believes that God is dead and that Satan is all that's left, and he finds out at the end that that's not the case. But yeah, I do think he kind of sees her as a challenge. And I don't know, I felt like at the end, Francesca, after her father was dead and Gino was gone, she hadn't necessarily gone to his side, but I think she was starting to kind of feel like there weren't many options left. But I did, Francesca was a really spunky character, because when he is trying to create conflict between the two women, and he puts Francesca in Juliana's bedroom, makes Juliana go stay somewhere else, which pisses her off. Juliana, I think, says at one point that she doesn't understand why Francesca isn't more excited to like be in this place. And Francesca says, I think she says something to the effect of, if my men die, I will too. And when I die, Prospero will. And I thought that was interesting, because I think in a lot of situations there, you might see like Gino at that point trying to rescue Francesca and saying, well, if I don't get her, I'll die, but Prospero will too, by my hand. But you have Francesca, this peasant woman, who's basically like, look, if y'all hurt my parents, if y'all hurt my dad and my betrothed, I may die, but I'm going to take Prospero out with me. And I thought that was interesting. There's no quarter with Francesca. She's constantly trying to figure out a way to get out, and she's not going to change just because of what's happening. I also like the little Vincent Price scenery chewing things when Prospero is telling Francesca all about how he's a Satanist, and he mouths the word devil because he knows it's going to scare her and creep her out. I mean, he's always just throwing out this stuff to shock her. And she is shocked, but she still hangs on, I think, to a kernel of herself, no matter what happens to her.
I completely agree. She's really fascinating, especially from the standpoint of a Gothic heroine, because she maintains that throughout, which is really interesting, which puts Vincent Price as the villain of the story, but he's also the main character because it's really his story. I mean, obviously in the Poe short story, it's definitely his story, but because of the big reveal at the end, like, the entire plot itself is hinging around this character. So I don't know. I think we ought to talk about Vincent Price's Prospero a little bit and who he is, because I find it fascinating. I love seeing Vincent Price be bad. We talked about this with The House on Haunted Hill. He plays it so well. He knows what he is doing. It's like he knows exactly what kind of movie he's in. But even from the moment that it opens, he is just plays he plays just such a cruel character who is just on a power trip throughout the whole movie, because that's the way it starts, right? It starts when he's in the village with, well, I guess it's Juliana. And then, of course, he realizes that the old woman has become sick, and he recognizes it for what it is, and that's when he goes away. But there were just so many points throughout the movie that he had a chance to demonstrate just truly how cruel he was. And some of it you could read as self-preservation, which, not that I necessarily agree with, but at least you could understand what was going on in his head. Like, for instance, when the father with his young child try to get into the castle walls when they're seeking shelter, and instead of just turning them away, like, he basically he orders everybody to be killed. And it's just kind of like, you're not coming in here, because, he's wanting to keep the sickness out. But then there are also these moments of just kind of casual cruelty, like when he's throwing the party, and he's telling everybody that the Masque is going to start at midnight, and he's throwing the like beads. He's basically having like Mardi Gras in his home. And he's throwing the beads and watching his, like, presumably his friends scatter around on the floor to like pick up the jewels and stuff that he's thrown at them. And he makes a comment, which I wish I had written down now, which was something along the lines of, look at how pathetic they're being, basically. They have all the money in the world, and yet they're still greedy, and they'll still, scrounge around like animals, just trying to get whatever I throw at them. And then there was, again, when he has Juliana and he brings out her father and her, I guess, boyfriend, lover, husband, I can't remember. It's some sort of romantic relationship, and has them do the like poison knife fight. At that point, that was just pure cruelty. That wasn't anything. That wasn't like keeping the illness out. That was just, I have the power, so therefore I'm going to wield the power over you because I can. Which, I don't know, I found that really, really fascinating. And I'm curious, especially since y'all have had such interesting things to say about Juliana's character, what you thought about Prosperous, because a lot of that kind of the cruelty, I don't think was in Poe's story. There was a lot of greed and a lot of hubris in Poe's story, but I don't think there was that cruelty. That was something that was added in here. So I'm curious to hear your guys' thoughts on that.
I think, Ed, you said this very briefly before, like, expanding on it a bit more, but I think the key word here is power trip. Like, it really does feel like he is that sort of character, like you said, that really enjoys being the puppet master, that enjoys watching people grovel at him, and enjoys that feeling of power. And I guess in that sense, it kind of, to me, it makes a sort of sense that, of course, this kind of person would also be a Satanist, which, again, was not something that was in the source material, but that someone who is cruel and craves power, well, of course, they're going to gravitate towards a religion devoted around, sacrificing your soul for more power and that sort of thing. And yes, I know that's not what all incarnations of Satanism are like, but specifically in this time period, I'm sure that that's kind of more what it would be. But yeah, I really feel like it made an interesting addition, I guess, to the story. It gave it more depth. I think just having a prince who's lavish, who's just tired of quarantining, throwing a party, and everybody dying because of the plague. Yes, that's a great story, and like you said, kind of at the top of the show, a lot more prescient now in early 2021 after a year of quarantining. But I think it does it makes him a more interesting character to have this motivation of cruelty and coming from this place of enjoying the power that it gives. And not to get too overtly political, but it reminds me of a certain ex-president that we recently had.
Yeah, I can totally see that. I feel the same way. I think that this is kind of a lesson in like how power and greed can corrupt. And that's not to say that everyone in power and everybody who has money or has these negative aspects to them, but it's a trope that we unfortunately see all too often, even in 2021. And yeah, I think Prospero is selfish. He is self-preserving. And yeah, he just loves the idea of power. From the very first scene when he goes to the village first when he discovers Red Death is there, he immediately wants to get out, and he wants to only take the people with him for his entertainment if they haven't been exposed to it. But even then, when he's going to kill Gino and the father, I can't remember his name now. I think it was Ludo. I can't remember precisely what his name was, but it was Gino and the father. Francesca, the peasant girl's like begging for their lives, and he's like, okay, well, you choose which one lives or dies, once he knows how much these two men mean to her. And that is cruel. It's not just like, well, I'm going to kill them because I have the power and you all my villagers, and I leave you starving and take all your stuff and you work for me. But it's like, okay, if you want one of these people to live, I'll give you mercy and you choose who lives. Or when the aristocrat wants to come in and he finds out that he went through the village and he's not going to let him in, and the guy's begging for his life, and he says, well, you can have my wife who you've been lusting over. And he's like, well, I've already had her. And then the guy's like, do whatever you want. Like, I'll do it just to survive. And I feel like these people who are coming to his balls are just as like unprincipled as he is. He just has more power than them. Even his making people act like animals, like everything is for his own. Even his experiments on people and his psychological experiments on Francesca are for his own kind of power trip that he has. It almost becomes, I think he does a great job with it, and I think it's a pretty well done movie, but it almost becomes laughable when every scene he's like showing her some new horror to show his power, like the people he tortures and his falcon. And I mean, everything with him is a power trip. And I do think it's interesting that he sees Satan as power, the ultimate kind of Lord of the Flies and the fallen angel, as he says over and over again, kind of like the ultimate rebel, I suppose, that he's following along with him. So yeah, I agree with you, Matt, that I feel like almost everything he does is either self-centered or some way to exert power. And when people don't go along with what he wants, he makes it even worse. Well, if you guys won't sword fight to the death for my entertainment, I'll make you do Russian roulette with daggers. Like, everything he does is calculated for his own entertainment. Even his apprentice Juliana, when she finally brands herself and all this other stuff she does, he sicks his falcon on her. Like, he can't let anybody come close to him because he needs to be the one in power, and everybody else is his puppets.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, yes, he is on a huge power trip throughout. I'm not going to compare him to any certain past presidents because you're not ruining this movie for me in that way.
I wasn't trying to ruin by any means.
No, the thing that gets me, because he does, on the one hand, he just seems like, well, he's on a power trip. He's this guy who's basically gotten everything that he wants. He's got the most money, the most power. People just, bend to his will, almost to the point that he's bored of it all, because he's just like, if I want a woman, I can have her. Like, if I want your wife, I can have her. If I want you to be scurrying around on your hands and knees, I can do that. If I want to make you play Russian roulette with a knife, I can do that. Which, okay, that I understand. That's the, this is the typical power hungry person with too much power. The thing that always gets me is towards the end, and I think it's the introduction of religion into this. That is an entirely this is entirely the movie's doing. This is not from the source material, and that they did make him not just, okay, he's a Satanist, which fits for the time period, because in the 60s, if you needed like shorthand in a horror movie for why people were bad, make them devil worshippers, and that's good enough. But I think it was the earnestness that he believed in it that gets me at the end. I already mentioned that he sees this, like he sees himself in Juliana because he sees that level of faith. But then when it's pushed back on him that, like, I think the line is something along the lines of, you may, like, he says, I'll be okay. I made a pact with the devil. Let me see if I wrote it down. Yeah, he says, I brought them up. Yeah, I brought, Satan, all these corrupted souls. Like, he's going to be so happy with me. I made a pact with the devil. And basically, this is when I'm jumping ahead a little bit, because this is when the Red Death actually shows up. And we'll talk about that a little bit. But, he says, I made a pact with the devil. And it's thrown back at him that, well, it doesn't matter if you made a pact with the devil or not, because a pact with the devil isn't going to save you. Because the look on his face when that is said to him, I don't know, it's just a really interesting moment, because it's not just a man who realizes that there's something he doesn't have power over. I think it's almost like somebody losing his faith all in one moment, which I don't know. I thought that was a really, it's always fascinating to me how it's treated, because it's kind of like he thought he had everything figured out. I mean, essentially he is a fanatic, like he's an evangelical fanatic for the devil, right? Over the course of this movie. And by the end, he realizes that he based his whole life on something that he got wrong or that he misunderstood. He thought that God had died a long time ago, and so that there only was the devil like left, and that the devil was controlling everything. And so if he makes a pact with the devil, then he's basically made, a position at the right-hand man of the guy, he's the right-hand man now. So I don't know. I found that very fascinating.
Yeah, it was interesting that his conviction of faith did stay through the entire movie. Like there was no point did he waver. At no point even at the end, did he recant what he believed. So, or say, God have mercy, spare me, or anything like that, really. So I'm like what you said about the juxtaposition between Francesca and him as both being of very strong faith, but just opposite ends of the spectrum, so to speak. I did find that interesting, especially for a movie that came out in the 60s. I would have expected something at the end of maybe, him saying something along those lines, but he didn't. So I thought that was a very interesting touch.
Yeah, I agree. I found it. I wrote down this, one of the things that the Red Death said to him, because he's basically yelling. He thinks the Red Death is Satan, and so he's like, "Look at all these souls, I'm bringing with me. Am I not great?" And yeah, it's very evangelical. He's very much trying to do for Satan what he thinks Francesca wants to do for her God, and the Red Death is trying to disabuse him of this. And he says, "Death has no master. Each man creates his own God for himself, his own heaven, his own hell." And of course, that's approximately the time when he sees his face is under the robe. And yeah, I thought it was interesting because it was a really neat turnabout, like you were saying, Matt, from him telling Francesca, well, your God is dead and mine's a survivor, and this is great. He realizes that his faith has been empty the whole time, according to Death, because Death is basically saying, well, if everybody is creating their own God for themselves and their own heaven, their own hell, then, he's basically going through what he tried to force Francesca to go through. And I thought that was it was kind of nihilistic, but it even though for some reason the Red Death does decide to spare people, which I thought was interesting. It's like I don't know. It's like the plague and pestilence kind of chose the people who deserve to live at the end, Francesca and Gino and the little tiny dancer, as they called her, the little girl, the old man, and Hop Toad. But yeah, at the end, I don't know, it kind of felt like a little bit nihilistic to me. I also thought it was interesting that Red Death used tarot cards, but we can get to that later. But yeah, I mean, basically Prospero is like, wow, everything I was saying earlier about God, I don't think he has enough time to go through all this in his head, but what he did, he's not going to some happy paradise for Satan worshipers. Like things are not going to be good for him. He's just hit the end.
Well, and he even says that to Francesca at one point that she can join him among the high ranks of people in hell. So like he's fully expecting to go to hell. He just expects to be like a prince in hell, not somebody being tortured.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, he's going to be in like the upper echelon of hell, and not the one going through all the pain and the horror.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so there's a couple of things I want to talk about here, because now, I mean, we're at the part of the movie which is essentially what I was excited about, because it's the party, it's the Masque. You get to see all the cool rooms, and you get to see everybody having a party, because in the post story, everybody is having just this grand time going through these rooms that have been fabulously decorated. When a masked stranger shows up, now of course it's a masquerade, so you expect people to come, except this figure, and I'm getting this from the story, is dressed like death. So in the story, it's described this way: the figure was tall and gaunt, shrouded from head to foot in the habiliments of the grave. The mask which concealed the visage was made so nearly to resemble the countenance of a stiffened corpse that the closest scrutiny must have difficulty in detecting the cheat. And yet this might have been endured, if not approved, by the mad revelers around. I'm skipping a little bit, but his vesture was dabbled in blood. His broad brow, with all the features of his face, was besprinkled with the scarlet horror. So he looks like, they think that this is a man who's been dressed up to look like a corpse of the Red Death, and everybody's a little bit horrified. But then he begins basically chasing the prince through the party with a dagger. And so it turns into almost, the way I always imagined it in my head is it's like a slasher. Like this is Poe's slasher film, essentially, because everybody's at this party and they're going wild. And they see the masked killer come in and they're like, ha ha ha, until they realize that he wants to kill, and it becomes a chase. And so he chases the prince through all the 6 chambers. You see him going through until he gets, of course, at the end in the black room with the black clock, and gets him. So that's what happens in the post story. This is a little bit different, like y'all have mentioned. So for one thing, the masked figure that shows up is dressed all in red, which I guess fits the Red Death. But he's very much a masked figure, and we don't know who's under there. He comes in, everybody's doing what I call the red dance scene. It's where everybody in the party is dancing, and they all have that red makeup on their face. And they're dancing almost like they're under a trance. This is where Vincent Price gets to have the conversation like that you were referencing, Mel, with the idea that death has no master, and that people essentially create their own gods, and with it they create their own hell and their own heaven. And this is where Vincent Price realizes that he messed up big time and that he really cannot control everything. But I'm so curious about some of the choices that were made in adapting this. For one, in the story, pretty much everybody dies. It says at the end of the story that he, being this like masked figure, had come like a thief in the night, and then one by one, the revelers in the blood-bedewed halls fall and die. And then as the last one dies, then the ebony clock stops. And the story ends very nihilistically, Mel. In darkness and decay, and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all. The kind of the idea that it's going to get you no matter what. Now, in this one, it's a little bit different because Vincent Price, or Prospero, makes the question, or poses the question, are you going to kill everyone? Like, once he realizes that this is essentially death standing in front of him, he says, are you going to take everyone? And Death responds, no, like, I'm not here to take all. So I guess there's that idea that he is going to save some of them. There are the tarot cards, which we need to talk about. I still don't know what to make of the fact that it's Vincent Price's own face under the mask. Like, what is that supposed to mean? Is it just that we're supposed to believe that he did this? Like, he was the one responsible? I don't know. I don't know. I mean, it's a cool reveal. When he pulls up the hood and he sees his own face, and it's this is like horror. Is that him facing his own mortality? Like, was Corman getting philosophical with that? I don't know what happened.
I think it was psychological, because this man is obsessed with terrors, right? Like, he has that lecture that he gives everybody where he says what they're the three terrors is hearing time pass, like listening to the clock and knowing time is passing. I guess as you're getting older, hearing your failing heartbeats and the footsteps of the assassin coming to get you. And throughout this, those terrors kind of, they happen to people. And he even says it again right before he sticks the falcon on Juliana. He says, she still has other terrors to learn, or whatever. I feel like his terror is his mortality, because he's obsessed with it, but he's projecting it on everybody else by trying to control theirs and think that he's invincible. And I also think that it's a Red Death, because at the beginning of the movie, the first thing that we see in the beginning of the movie is the Red Death playing with his tarot cards, and then he gives the rose to the old woman and says to tell them their deliverance is at hand, which is pretty ambivalent and slightly evil sounding, because their deliverance is death. But when Prospero shows up at the village, I think we see exactly what his weakness is, which is mortality and the Red Death. Because when he sees that the woman has died of the Red Death, he freaks out. And that's when he comes up with his whole plan that he asked Gino and Ludovico and Francesca, have you touched her? Okay, good. You're okay. Everybody else is going to die. We're going to burn y'all down. Nobody can come in my walls. Like, everything is like, I'm going to build this wall and it's going to keep this disease out, which happens in the story too. They actually weld every place with metal to keep everybody out and to keep the illness out. But I feel like that's his weakness, is he knows what the Red Death can do. He knows what the odds are. Disease is, one of those terrors, because you're failing heartbeat and the passing of time. And I think at the end, it's like, not only is his faith wrecked, but he's facing the thing that he's been trying to ignore, not pay attention to, or get power over the whole time. And so that was how I interpreted it. It could have been, just like, well, this will be creepy if he takes off the mask and sees his own face. Let's do it. It'll scare people. But I kind of read it as him facing himself, like the emptiness of his faith, and the thing that he's feared this whole time, which is death. And the Red Death is ultimately uncontrollable, because death is chance, right? Like, even though it seems like the six folks at the end of this movie maybe deserve to be alive, and that death was picking and choosing, when there's plague or pestilence, not everybody is going to die. And so it just depends on, I guess, what card you're drawing is maybe what they were trying to say. I'm a little bit less clear on that, but that was kind of how I was interpreting that. I don't know. It was a cool trope. It was a cool thing to bring into it.
I don't know. I'm still leaning towards, it would be really cool if he lifted it up and saw his own face.
That's probably it. And then people like me come up with a reasoning.
Because I don't know. Like, I know you're right. At the beginning, he was terrified. Like, I took the beginning where we see the hooded Red Death figure as being the idea of things like this just kind of happen by chance. It's kind of like the laws of nature. Is if you just happen to be in a place where now this disease is going to flare up, and so that's what he was doing with those cards. If I was going to read way too much into it, that tarot cards I'm talking about it like this was actually set in like a real time, and all we get is something vaguely Renaissance. Like, I don't even think it tells us a specific year it's supposed to be set in, but like vaguely medieval, maybe medieval Renaissance. We're smushing a few hundred years together and we're saying it takes place somewhere around there. And then but Italian, like the tarot cards would have been played by like the wealthy aristocratic people of the time. If I'm, like I said, if I'm reaching for straws here, but I don't think that. I think it was supposed to be this is chance. But I don't know. His whole thing of being afraid of the Red Death, but then also thinking he's got everything locked down. And if he dies, he's going to be like a prince in hell or whatever. I don't know. It just didn't make sense to me.
Well, I think that may have been. I mean, that's kind of how I read his face being the face of the Red Death. It was about his own hubris and his own ego that he had kind of brought this down on himself. That yes, you've quarantined, but you didn't really quarantine very well. You brought in all of these outsiders during this time of this illness, and yeah, you killed the guy who went through the village, but that doesn't mean that these other people weren't exposed to it. And you're this cruel, like venal, petty guy who had to have this gigantic extravaganza, and yeah, now you're paying the price for it. Your hubris and ego is what's done it. Now, as for what the tarot meant, I don't know.
Well,
I don't know if they work with that reading or not, but
we're also really reading hard into these small things in this movie that, like, let's face it, a lot of it, like, especially once they get to the party itself and the rooms, that is what is cool about the story itself, is that it's a guy in a mask and a knife chasing somebody through all these rooms that are like all the colors of the rainbow. It's a cool visual. But in this movie, all that is like one acid trip after another. I mean, like we're picking at small things like the tarot cards when there are large chunks of the movie that are just like blue smoke swirling around women. Which, I don't know, strikes me as kind of funny. Okay. Yeah, I'm just, I am laughing at us a little bit. I'm poking fun at the three of us for trying to dig so deep and find meaning in a Roger Corman movie, which I'm not saying that Roger Corman movies don't have deep meanings to them, but I think one thing Corman did really well is he just knew how to make a really great movie. And he knew how to make something that was enjoyable and that people would be like, oh, that was a cool thing. Kind of like finding out that you were death all along. I mean, what a twist is that? So I will say that this is just a fun Corman movie. I feel like there are a few connections before I do take us out that we should mention. Mel had actually pointed this out to me earlier, that the cinematographer was Nicholas Roeg, who in the 70s would go on to make the movie Don't Look Now, which was based on the Daphne du Maurier's, what is it, a novella or a story? I can't remember now. Short story. So that is another kind of horror classic. So a lot of these people worked on, each other's movies. So there was a lot of crossover. But we can't mention Vincent Price and Roger Corman without mentioning some of the other movies that Poe adaptations that they did. Otherwise, they're often called the Poe cycle, at least I know. I've referred to them a lot as the Poe cycle. So around this time, this was actually one of the later ones. It started in 1960 with the House of Usher, and then they did The Pit and the Pendulum, Tales of Terror, Premature Burial, The Raven, The Haunted Palace, and then of course this one, The Masque of the Red Death. Then ended with The Tomb of Ligeia in 1964. Those are typically the ones people talk about when they talk about the Poe cycle of movies. A lot of them starred Vincent Price. I think 7. I think that was, yeah, I think 7 of those had, I'm counting in my head right now, included Vincent Price. The only one that I think didn't was The Premature Burial. But there are more films with that. So those are a lot of fun. If you're looking for more Poe stories, especially if you're looking for more Vincent Price kind of Poe crossover, I highly recommend looking at some of these. The Pit and the Pendulum is super fun. House of Usher is a lot of fun too. I think there was also Tales of Terror that had some of the short stories in it, including The Black Cat, which is one that I like a whole lot. So yeah, there are some really great Roger Corman / Vincent Price / Edgar Allan Poe crossovers there. Lots of things to watch for that. Well, I think that's as good a place as any. So I'm going to leave it right there. We're at No Fear Cast on Twitter and Instagram. We have a Facebook page as well. Our email is nofearcast@gmail.com. If you love what we're doing, consider supporting us on Patreon. You'll get access to exclusive content. Or simply rate and review us, which is entirely free and helps other listeners find us. Theme music for this episode is by Nicholas Gasparini. Thanks for listening. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.